a part of the East Bay Housing Organization's Affordable Housing Month. So we'd love to start off with a word from EBHO's lead organizer, Dolores Tejada, and resident leader and board member, Stevie Dawson.
Oh, hi. My name is Stevie Dawson, and I'm a resident of affordable housing. I am also a member of the East Bay Housing Organization's Board of Directors. EBHO, the East Bay Housing Organization, has been working together with its members since 1984 to create, protect, and preserve affordable housing for low-income communities across the East Bay. We've done this by advocating, organizing, educating, and building coalitions. We celebrate Affordable Housing Month to draw attention to the housing crisis, to offer solutions, and to celebrate our achievements at 20 events across Alameda and Contra Costa counties during the month of May. Please take a look at our calendar of events. Our theme is affordable homes for all. We believe that communities are healthiest and most powerful when we have affordable homes for everyone that needs a home, and when those most affected by this crisis of housing can shape their own futures. So we thank All Home for helping us to further our mission. In today's very difficult environment, what you do is more important than ever for advancing social and racial justice, prosperity, and sustainability. Today, we're here to celebrate and to learn. But after this, let's take action. I invite everyone to join me as a proud EBHO member and learn about housing opportunities and resources, properties, and housing policy information. All of this is available in our online affordable housing study room. As a member of EBHO, we will further our mission to create, preserve, and protect affordable homes for all. So please contact us if you're interested, because housing is a human right. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Stevie. Really appreciate this opportunity to partner with EBHO on today's event. So I'm excited to kick us off. My name is Tamika Moss, and I'm the founder and CEO of All Home, and we have a fantastic panel for you all this afternoon. Just wanting to make sure that understanding the relationship between interim housing and permanent housing is so critical as we tackle the homelessness crisis in our region. And we're going to hear from our panel this afternoon around how we do that, why it is not an either or situation in our region. We both need permanent and interim housing solutions to ensure that people have an opportunity to come off our streets and progress into permanent housing to be able to thrive in their own lives. So we're going to have 3 presentations and time for Q&A afterward. So please put your questions in the chat throughout the conversation today, and we'll have time to answer a few of those questions after each presentation. And for now, feel free to share in the chat who you are, your title and organization. We'd love to know who's in the room with us today and anything that you're hoping to get out of the conversation today and what brought you here. So first, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Ken Kirky, who is our Chief Partnerships Officer here at All Home. He leads our Regional Impact Council, which is the body in which we have brought together stakeholders across every sector to help us come up with regional solutions to address homelessness and housing insecurity. And previously, Ken served as the planning director for MTC and ABAG. It was an amazing get to have him join the All Home team. And so I'm going to turn it over to Ken to get us kicked off.
Thank you, Tamika. Thanks for your kind words. And yes, I want to talk a little bit first about All Home and the Regional Impact Council. So All Home launched in 2019. Quickly thereafter, All Home started convening what Tamika just referred to, the Regional Impact Council, a mix of leaders of various perspectives, elected officials, business leaders, homelessness service providers, affordable housing leaders, and so forth, who got together in the midst of the pandemic to address the current homelessness crisis in the Bay Area first, and are now working on upstream issues that are root causes of homelessness. That first effort led to what is called the Regional Action Plan. It was launched in April of 2021. We celebrated the 1-year launch 1 month ago. And the RAP puts forward a 1-2-4 framework, which calls for simultaneous investments in interim, permanent, and prevention interventions to reach a 75% reduction of unsheltered homelessness in 3 years. So a very audacious goal for the Bay Area. And the reason the RIC believes this is possible is because it is an intermixing of these different solutions. In terms of our primary topic today, interim housing, it is one solution to creating new ways to house the more than 35,000 unsheltered individuals in the Bay Area. When a permanent home isn't available, and this is the case in some of our urban communities, in particular where there are really large numbers of people that are unhoused, and ISH, interim supportive housing, is done right, it's one step on the pathway to moving from being outdoors, being in situations that aren't really fit for human habitation, to a permanent home. It generally is a yes and approach that we need to be moving forward on multiple fronts if we really want to turn the tide on homelessness in the Bay Area. Next slide, please. So the 1-2-4, that ratio refers to a ratio of some analysis we did of what is needed in the region to reach this kind of dramatic reduction in unsheltered homelessness. That for every 1 unit of interim housing, there should be 2 permanent housing solutions and 4 prevention solutions. The ratio, however, is what is actually less important. It's really the concurrent investments, the simultaneous investments in all of these solutions, and ensuring that interim housing is a brief stop. It is temporary housing on the way to permanent housing, which is what people need to thrive. Interim housing can look like some of the things listed here in the bullets: navigation centers that offer privacy, tiny homes, modular units, managed RV and mobile home parks, safe parking sites. And it can also look like rapid resolution toward permanent housing. Next slide, please. So interim supportive housing in many respects is a new, in its current form and its evolving form, and we're fortunate to have a couple of real experts in the field here with us today. It is evolving. As the Regional Impact Council defined interim housing in the Regional Action Plan, there are a couple of key components that are identified here on the right hand of this slide. One is that flexibility is key. We have a lot of diverse communities in the Bay Area. They have different needs. Homelessness actually takes on somewhat different composition in different communities, has somewhat different drivers, and conditions vary. Generally speaking, it is viewed as something that is non-congregate. One of the things that we have, I think, really come to realize regionally is that congregate shelter has many limitations. One of them is related to public health. It became very apparent during the COVID crisis, but there is also a dignity, a sense of autonomy that is provided to individuals when they have a door that locks, when they can live in a clean facility, when they know where they can return every night, when they have other supportive services such as mental or physical health supports, financial benefits assistance, employment assistance, and also assistance to find their way to whatever permanent housing solution is appropriate for them. And that it's defined as both something that is predictable, so you know where home is on a given day, you know where you're going to be that night, but you also know that it's a short-term stay. It's a pathway on the way to a permanent home. It is, with all of that, it is something that's evolving. And this is playing out in a number of ways in the region right now. There isn't really a clear consensus, for example, on terms and definition. Interim housing is used sometimes in political realms and otherwise as a way to describe both types of construction and how facilities will be used by residents. There's also kind of mixed messaging out there to some extent around what interim supportive housing is and what it isn't. To be clear, in terms of the Regional Action Plan and what the Regional Impact Council is putting forward, interim supportive housing can't be the end goal. It cannot be the end goal for people who are unhoused. It is temporary housing, and it must lead to a permanent housing solution. It does differ from traditional homeless shelters. And this is something that, again, I think has become that much more apparent during this period, that in addition to the shortcomings of traditional shelter around the public health issue, the lack of storage, the lack of privacy, the fact that people have to leave the facilities typically during the day, that they don't have storage, that they sometimes can't have pets. If they're partnered, they can't be partnered in the facility in many cases, and that there are limited services. These are all things that suggest that there is a better way to move forward, and the interim supportive housing can play an important role in the region moving forward. Next slide, please. So we're going to hear from Joanne and Sharon about some really good examples in the region. A couple of them are here on the slide. There are a number of interim supportive housing projects that are advancing in the region. One of them in Contra Costa County, Delta Landing, received a Homekey grant in 2020 and opened in December 2021. It was formerly a motel. It's now a state-of-the-art 172 unit interim housing facility that offers healthcare, housing navigation, case management provided as well on site. The Santa Rosa Safe Parking Pilot Program has been up and running since March of this year. So it's a very new site. It starts with 50 spots. It's expected to expand from that. In many parts of the region, as I'm sure many of you are aware, RVs, vehicles, mobile units of some type are what unhoused people have turned to for housing. And these sites can provide both a safe place with services for those individuals, and also some of the same services I mentioned that are offered at other interim supportive housing sites, such as employment services, such as mental and behavioral health, and also information on permanent supportive housing. Next slide, please. So as I've already talked about, the COVID pandemic changed the way we do lots of things. It impacted life in many, many ways. And one of the ways it impacted unhoused people is that it made it apparent that congregate shelter wasn't workable in the public health crisis. The state acted very aggressively and efficiently around creating new funding, launching Project Homekey, then later Project Homekey, to utilize empty motels and hotels for short-term housing and replace the traditional congregate shelter space. They've now built upon that, and there's more funding available that local jurisdictions have been taking advantage of, and nonprofits in the region. Interim housing is really structured in a way that is flexible for different jurisdictions. And I think oftentimes it gets confused in terms of it's in competition with permanent supportive housing. It is not. There may be, and there are some communities in the region where the homelessness population is at a certain size that there may not be as much need for interim supportive housing. But again, in communities where there are large numbers of unhoused people, this is a way to get people into a stabilized situation that provides them with intensive support services and helps them make an exit to permanent housing. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges that need to be worked through as the Regional Impact Council and our partners work together to implement the Regional Action Plan, and just holistically, the Bay Area seeks to address its homelessness crisis. Funding is an issue. Interim housing has historically been underfunded and deprioritized. For both interim housing and permanent supportive housing, operations and services funding is inadequate. To ensure a certain level of quality, a certain level of funding must be maintained. Limited staffing capacity is a challenge in the homelessness space generally. This affects the ability of jurisdictions to stand up these facilities. It also results in both caseloads that are too high for the people who are working in the facilities, and a turnover of staffing that can negatively impact unhoused people who are seeking to move toward a permanent housing solution. So that is something we hear over and over again that must be addressed. And there, as I mentioned earlier, there are competing priorities that must be addressed. Moving toward interim supportive housing as part of the mix, along with permanent housing solutions and prevention solutions on the front end, is what we believe can really drive down homelessness in the Bay Area. Investment in one type of housing isn't going to be enough, and investment in one type of housing alone, without adequate funding for the others, will not allow us to achieve that 75% reduction goal. Next slide, please. And that is it for me for now. I guess I'll turn it back to Tamika.
Thank you so much, Ken, for that overview and explanation of some of the challenges and opportunities with interim supportive housing. We do have a question in the chat from Marin County Supervisor Stephanie Moulton-Peters, who really has a question about the funding challenge that you lifted up in your presentation. What are the sources of continuous funding for interim housing? We want to make sure that we have that conversation or answer that question. Maybe if you have some initial thoughts, but also would love to hear Sharon and Joanne's perspective on that as we continue through the conversation.
I guess the quick answer, Supervisor, it's still evolving. The governor's budget and the revised budget is coming out, as I understand it, tomorrow, reflects the prioritization of interim supportive housing as something that's needed in the state to address the massive number of people living outdoors and get people on this path that I spoke about. The state has also put forward HAP plans that also mirror this mix of funding types. Many of the jurisdictions, including Marin, are working on these right now. All of that said, at least from my perspective, and Tamika or others can correct me if I'm wrong, but we still need a lot more services funding, and we still need operations funding, not just for interim supportive housing, but for permanent supportive housing. So that's an area where there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I touch on it in my presentation because the cost of housing is so enormous now that we need to drastically reduce the cost of housing and reimagine it. And then with the ongoing services, like that's why we're designing some of our units to be converted to permanent in future and apply some sort of shallow subsidy. There's also CalAIM, Medi-Cal. That's another big area where there's millions, if not billions, to go towards services, but it follows the person around rather than the project.
That's great, Joanne. All right, so we'll dive into that a little bit more and get others' thoughts. But at this point, I wanted to introduce Sharon Lai, Executive Director of Dignity Moves. Sharon has more than 10 years experience as a city planner, most of that time in San Francisco, and then several years of directing commercial, residential, hospitality, real estate development before founding Dignity Moves. So Sharon, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Tamika. Really fun to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. We have quite a bit to cover, and I think we're a couple of minutes behind, so I'm going to try to go pretty fast. Let's go to the next slide here. I will spend a bit more time on this next one. Thank you. So I came to Dignity Moves basically when it was a concept during the pandemic, and we're so new. We're still in startup mode. Basically, I've only been a nonprofit for about 6 months. So essentially, the concept for Dignity Moves is that we're trying to bring philanthropy, private sector resources, development skills together, and to offer it to municipalities and try to meet them where they're at. At our core, our vision is to address what Ken was describing, the need to address the unsheltered homelessness, and that is presenting differently in different contexts. So, in one of the statistics that we had looked at, when we were getting started, is the fact that unsheltered homelessness costs the community actually a lot more than if we tried to shelter people and connect people with services. There's this one economic roundtable report from Southern California from I think 2013 that I can certainly add to the link later, that shared that for every dollar in local funds spent to house people and to provide supportive services to the patient, it's estimated to reduce the public costs for the patient by about $6. So it's actually 6 times savings annually if you actually just invested in housing. So, based on that concept, we also looked at the cost and time required to provide permanent supportive housing, and agree with what Ken was saying, that is definitely the gold standard. We do need a lot more permanent supportive housing. But, as this group will appreciate, the cost per unit is, can easily be $750,000 plus. In San Francisco, I've seen it even at $1 million a unit and easily take 5 years to construct. The problem with what the timeline and the cost associated with providing permanent supportive housing, even though that is the ideal solution, is that it is in a way perpetuating the street trauma and impacting outcomes of individuals. The longer we leave people on the streets, the worse their outcomes would become. And then we also looked at the cost of other types of shelter, including navigation centers, which I think has been a very good model. It has certainly helped San Francisco and other municipalities a lot. And I think in terms of construction timing, it's very promising. It's in most cases it's able to be constructed in less than a year. Just citing some of the cost references though, one of the newer ones in San Francisco at the Embarcadero, which is operated by Five Keys, one of our partners, service partners, it costs them about $62,000 per bed. And again, as Ken had pointed out, that's a congregate setting and there are limitations to it. So, Dignity Moves is trying to provide an alternative solution. Again, it's not the end all be all. It's not the only solution out there, but we felt that there is room to iterate, to try to combine some of the concepts from navigation and permanent supportive housing into a concept that is interim supportive housing, where we're trying to get costs and time efficiency all in one package. So let's go on to the next slide here. One of our main pillars is to try to provide a format of housing that removes barriers from people to accept them. And as Ken mentioned, in some of the congregate shelter options, because you can't easily accommodate partners, pets, possessions, the top 3 Ps that people talk about as reasons why people would turn down shelter options. We try to design solutions from the get-go where these would not be an issue. So for example, we're providing individual private spaces where people's possessions can be safe and locked, and with a private room, they can have their pets, and we built in pet relief areas and things like that I'll show you in a little bit. But basically, designing the solution is part and parcel of what we're trying to do. And a lot of the points that Ken has already touched on. Let's go ahead and go into the next slide. Thank you, Naima. So yeah, we basically have 2 models. We are delivering low cost and fast delivery of projects as essentially the nonprofit development partner in the equation. We have one model that we call temporary projects, temporary sites. So these projects, we're aiming for sites that will allow us to be there between 3 to 5 years. And then we also have a permanent project model, which will be there a minimum of 15 years. In the temporary project situation, we are using a technology that we call, it's prefabrication, but it's not modular. It's actually an on-site assembly system. And this system allows the units to meet emergency housing code standards and can last for about 20 years. We've been successful at piloting this in a couple of locations and seeing the cost per unit come in at around $30,000 to $55,000 per room, and that's amortizing across all of the shared amenities such as dining halls, case management offices, other on-site common shared spaces costs, which is pretty competitive compared to, let's say the navigation center per bed costs, in the 6 days or so. And, these are not intended to be permanent solutions, or they're not supposed to be on the site permanently. The majority of our pilots are actually on sites that will eventually become permanent affordable housing sites. But, for a variety of reasons, there are just sites out there that has to sit vacant for a couple of years while they either go through entitlements or get their financing stack ready. So the concept here is that we're trying to make use of land that is currently really not being productive in the economy and put housing there, quickly. So the permanent option, we're typically basically partnering with municipalities that already have land there. The construction is meant to be permanent, meaning that the units can actually even be converted to permanent supportive housing in the future if desired. The construction duration is definitely longer, but we're able to lean on the modular manufacturing technology and get the construction period down to between 8 and 12 months. And actually, Joanne's going to cover a lot more of that in her part of the presentation. Let's go on to the next slide. So in our very first pilot project, which is located in San Francisco, it's at Goff and Market Street. This is a very unique project. We were lucky enough to partner with the city of San Francisco with both HSH, DPW, as essentially the lead applicant, and we're assisting them with delivering this project as the philanthropic partner. So, basically it's a multi-party MOU situation, and this is a site that was previously an abandoned parking lot. It's actually 2 parking lots. It used to be the City College administrative building that became abandoned over the years. And during the pandemic, the city had leased the land actually from a private developer who has rights to redevelop the site. And the city had been using it as a safe sleeping site and accommodated 44 tents across the site. So here's some photos of what it used to look like. And with the support of a lot of our philanthropic partners, we were able to iterate this brand new format of housing into our pilot project, which we can go on to the next slide to show some visuals of this. Thanks. So basically, this is what it looks like right now. We were able to phase the construction of the project so that we didn't have to displace the existing tenants by basically aggregating them into one side of the site while we phase the construction and then slowly move people into the individual rooms. We were very lucky that the city was willing to step up as a partner to iterate the permitting process with us. This is very new to them. They've never done this before. So convincing the city to be at the table was certainly a very important step in this partnership. We were able to actually get our permits in less than 3 weeks, which is pretty unheard of in San Francisco. So in this particular site, what the city provided was the land, because they already had leased it for the safe sleep project. And they continued to fund the services on the site, which is provided by Urban Alchemy, the service provider for the site. The structures themselves and the labor cost, basically the cost of the capital project, was all done through philanthropy, through Dignity Moves. We did a really great job fundraising in a very short period of time. One of the really important things that we learned is, how to make use of existing resources, but leveraging them to attract private dollars and philanthropic dollars, which was a really important aspect of building this coalition of support. So we were able to begin construction around the beginning of this year and start moving the first set of residents basically at the end of February. So the pace is pretty fast. We're about to complete all phases of construction in the next 2 weeks, and we're actually having our open house at 33 Goff on May 26th, and you're all invited to come if you would like to see it, or reach out to me separately and we can certainly arrange for a tour. Let's go on to the next slide. Thanks. So, one of the ways that we tried to iterate on testing this pilot and how to reduce costs, it's certainly tricky in this case because the project site the lease was only for about a year when we took on the project. And so the city has an option to extend the lease for 2 more years, and we're very hopeful that they will do that. But in order to offset the costs of the infrastructure and just, everything, we brought on a lot of volunteer labor, a lot of pro bono services and in-kind donations to make this pilot happen. And we were able to offset the cost dramatically. I also feel like that was a really good way to engage the community. So it's really been a fantastic opportunity to get labor involved and our private businesses in the community who's been very much so, I think, pushing the city's administration in addressing homelessness to be part of the solution. I'm going to go into the next slide there. Our second pilot project is in downtown Santa Barbara. And in this project, again, we're trying to meet municipalities where they're at. So we format the funding of each project a little differently. Santa Barbara County was a little bit more willing to risk their government dollars on pilot projects. And in this case, they provided the land, the services, as well as half of the construction costs, which certainly helped us with being able to invest in more permanent infrastructure, as well as mobilize the project a little faster. Our operator there is a Good Samaritan who has many decades of experience operating interim and transitional housing. They currently operate other sites that have cabin type of projects. And so in this project, it's smaller, it's 33 units. Again, this is a site that's been earmarked for affordable housing, but the county, based on their own capital dollar plans, they are not ready to mobilize for at least 3 years. So we're able to take advantage of this parking lot site and convert it into an interim housing project. How are we doing on time? I think I'm originally scheduled to be done already.
Yeah, if you want to wrap it up, we'll get to Joanne and then answer questions at the end.
I'm going to just quickly jump to the next 2 slides and you can just flash them real quick. Our other permanent projects are basically funded by Homekey. One of the important things that I wanted to highlight is that with our temporary projects, we're able to get the per acre density up to the 100s, between 140 to 160 rooms per acre, which is very high. For these Homekey projects, we're around 50 to 60 rooms per acre. And the flexibility is definitely very important here. In some of our villages, we have en suites and it's multi-story, and others it's single story, and that certainly has a factor in the construction costs as well. But I'll let Joanne dig into the Homekey funding, but basically the other pipeline opportunities for us to build permanent projects is not only leaning on state funding, but also institutional funding. Just wanting to touch on that one earlier question about funding for services. I think one of the long-term partnerships that we're establishing is actually with hospitals and other institutions that have an obligation to provide exit strategies, including, there's a lot of other institutions out there that have this obligation and already receive funding from the state where they're really supposed to be planning for this. And that is an area that we are establishing and intending to build in the future. So with that, I'll just end there.
Thank you so much, Sharon. That was awesome. Joanne, I'm going to move to you so we can get to questions at the end. Folks, we have Joanne Price with us, Vice President for Real Estate and Operations at Life Moves. Joanne has a ton of experience working across the real estate investment and development portfolios. So Joanne, I'll turn it over to you to talk about your projects.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. And I just love Affordable Housing Month, bringing awareness to all these important issues we're facing. So next slide. So it's critical to interim housing and choosing the right operator to run these projects. And Life Moves is an exceptional provider of interim supportive housing with over 40 years of experience. And we have a very good, great success rate in moving people into stable housing. However, our success rates vary between program type, and that's important for reasons that are going to be apparent as we move through the presentation. So next slide. So these are some of the big issues resulting in homelessness directly related to lack of affordable housing. But it's critical to note that the majority experiencing homelessness are unsheltered. So in California, there's about 160,000 people who are experiencing homelessness, and 90,000 are unsheltered, meaning they're living on the streets or in vehicles. For comparison, in New York, there's 90,000 people experiencing homelessness, but only 4% are living on the streets. And the focus is critical because it's really challenging to deliver our services through car windows or on the streets. And why is that? It's because basic needs, shelter, food, security, are not being met. And so people are unable to focus on getting housed. And likewise, we see this with our outreach teams. It's hard to stay connected to folks on the streets when they're moving around. And it could be weeks before, case managers are connecting with their clients or issues arise and we can't find people on the streets. And there was a report out by the Turner Center last week that kind of confirmed this. And they, for the first time in that report, they talk about, I've just felt at peace. I could my stress levels gone down and I'm able to concentrate and better engage with my case managers. And for the first time in a long time, many of those people could envision a pathway out of homelessness. So on the street, I think Sharon touched on this, you're in a fight or flight mode constantly. And so you're not focusing on what you need to do to get into stable housing situation. So next slide. This is a little busy slide, but I think it kind of gives you an overview of where we are in our different services. So I talked about our success rates in different programs, and you'll see that when we build interim shelters, like the one at Mountain View, our success rate is tenfold what we're seeing on the street. So on the street, we see about 6% success rate into stable housing. It goes up slightly on a safe parking site, it's 33%, but it can be as high as 86% on a site. And one of the key to their success is having a non-congregate shelter. I think all the speakers have spoken about this. It's essential. All the research shows that congregate shelter is one of the biggest barriers to entry, as high as 64%. There was the RAND research paper that came out last week that talked about congregate shelters and people don't want to move into them. And I totally understand why. So when we're providing a non-congregate shelter, that means everybody has their own private unit with lockable front door, giving everybody their own personal space, because let's face it, we all need our own space from time to time. The second key to success, though, is the access to services and the resources. So we talk about case management, tailoring a custom plan to help you move onto your next part of the journey. There's behavioral help, medical help, and connection to housing and employment specialists. So when you compare the cost and the success of keeping people on the streets, there's reports out there that show it can cost up to $83,000 per year to keep somebody who's chronically homeless on the streets. And that's about $200 a night. Whereas when you look at the Mountain View model, it costs $75 per bed per night. And that comes with data. So on the streets, we're paying an extraordinarily high amount of money with no managed outcome, versus having interim solutions at different price points, like Dignity Moves that building for $30,000 a door, we're building for $200,000 a door. Mountain View was built at $130,000 a door, but that it all has the the support spaces that are necessary to work with folks. We're all about input, like the throughput, and not everybody that comes to our door requires a unit. Using Mountain View as an example, we said that we would take 20% of Mountain View's homelessness population off the streets on day one. We did that. Then we said that we'll serve at least 50% of your 2019 point in time count. And I'm pleased to say that we just passed that point a couple of days ago. And we've served 300 people, and we've moved 64% of our families into permanent housing, and about 39% of our singles are moved into stable housing. And that data is still being compiled. Next slide. So it's critical that our sites are located close to services. We need to be close to jobs and transit. Our data shows that a person really needs to be engaged in services for at least 90 days, 3 months to be successful, with a length of stay typically around 120 to 150 days and up to 180 days. And so it's essential when we're designing our sites that we have lots of space for support services to deliver and effectively deliver our services. And there's also things like, some of the amenities on site, like the clients, like think if you're on the streets, like how can you have a shower or get ready for a job interview? Like even if you don't have a fixed address, when you're coming onto our sites, you can kind of take a breather and just, and then focus on the steps that you need to work on with the direct guidance of a case manager and all these other amazing services that we offer. Next slide. So I just wanted to touch on some of the success, like the factors that go into making these sites a success. And when we're looking at interim to permanent, our sites, or the sites that Life Moves have developed and are developing, they're all permanent, which means that they're all connected to the ground and they will last 30, 40, if not 50 years. And now with the cost of services being critical, we're looking at how do we future-proof our units? So some of them we're making a bit bigger and making them compliant. So you could apply a housing voucher in the future, or you could apply a shallow subsidy to help offset some of the operating costs. And you need to make sure that there is an adequacy of services. There was the San Francisco Chronicle article that came out, which was a damning report on, neglecting the amount of money that's needed to continue to operate these sites. And that's why having options to possibly apply rents in future would help offset some of those costs. Like California needs, 2.4 million homes. And if we're building at 750,000 a door, and it's the same here, Sharon, in Santa Clara, $1 million per unit for an affordable housing unit. Like that's not a tenable situation to get everybody housed quickly. So having housing that can be put up a lot faster and for a fraction of the cost with some sort of shallow subsidy, it's going to move people off the streets quicker. And I think the biggest takeaway that I hope you'll take away with you today is that we need to bring folks in. Not only is it the right thing to do, it's the most cost-effective and most impactful. Last slide. And so this is where we like to kind of focus on the key, 4 key areas. It's building capacity. It's both permanent and interim to change and save lives. Expanding programs and services, it's critical to increasing impact and meeting the changing needs of folks who are on the streets. And we need to be able to measure that impact. That's why data is so important to help inform what we're doing. And lastly, I collaborate. Yeah, Sharon's touched on it, Ken touched on it. It's going to take government, public and private partnerships. So thank you for allowing me to present today.
Thank you so much, Joanne, and thank you, Sharon and Ken, for such great presentations. And Joanne, especially the piece about the data, really highlighting the data that is confirming that interim supportive housing is needed in the ecosystem as we try to address this crisis is really important. So we have about 9 minutes left, and we have some really great questions that I'll just throw out to you all. Caleb, hi Caleb, from the city of Oakland, is really asking about, are there jurisdictions that you would recommend that have good examples of places that are scalable, but also there seems to be a lot of individual proposals out there, but not a lot of systematic or regional approaches out there? Anybody want to respond to that question?
I'll take a go. So when you look at Mountain View was single level, and we always thought that there was opportunity to scale up. So now what we're seeing is with San Mateo County and the city of San Jose, looking to really densify those sites and build 2-3 stories up. And we want to keep reiterating on that to build the best possible project at the most cost-effective price, for most cost-effective, yeah?
I'll maybe add to that a little bit.
Please.
This is certainly very new because we're still executing the experiment essentially. But I really do feel like our partners at Santa Barbara County is trying to tackle it from a very systemic planning place, and they're able to do it because they are the county and they are
Right.
at the end of the day the responsible party for the region and with a lot of other resources. So we started with a single small pilot project on their land that they're actually intending to build the exit strategy there, which is the affordable housing, but we're also already project planning for 2 additional other basically temporary sites. In one of the locations we're looking at, the lot is actually large enough where we can do part of the site as these temporary interim structures, these cabin style structures. And on the other side of the site, we can pursue actually permanent supportive housing. So I don't have a good example of like something that's already been developed, but I think a chat with the Santa Barbara County could probably yield some useful conversations.
That's super helpful. Thank you, Sharon. Another question from Izani from MPH. How does folks experiencing homelessness get into interim housing?
It's typically through the county's coordinated entry system, and mostly will prioritize folks who are living on or near the sites in which we're building. So there's an encampment on our San Jose site. There's an encampment of about 15 people. They'll be like prioritized.
Yeah, and that's pretty consistent across the region that we see. All right, couple more. What policies and programs would you recommend prioritizing for cities to implement through their housing elements in order to facilitate more supportive housing production? Ken, maybe you can take that one.
Yeah, I mentioned, I put this in the chat. The Regional Impact Council is putting together a group. It will include Sharon and Joanne around developing a set of principles for the 3 legs of the stool that are the regional action plan, including interim supportive housing. As you probably gleaned from our conversation here, this is really a train that we're building while we're riding on it to some extent. There are organizations like Life Moves that have been at it for a while, do it very well. There are other organizations like Dignity Moves diving into this space and advancing it quickly. But for a lot of the jurisdictions in the region, they simply haven't done this type of housing before. So we want to pull together people to think through, what are some of the principles, what really makes for a successful outcome for the people served by an interim supportive housing site. How is it successful for the surrounding neighborhood so that there is support for interim supportive housing in a given community? And also looking at cost factors, the role of nonprofits versus city governments, I think anybody who works in this space knows cities start in different places in terms of their resource capacity, in terms of their availability, not just to fund something as complex as a housing site for people who have been unhoused, but also to maintain it, to have a relationship with the local community. And we're going to really try to take a look at that, provide answers, and make that available to jurisdictions, nonprofits, people in the region. So that's a stay tuned item. And I think it could be helpful with housing elements in particular.
That's great. Thank you, Kim. Sharon, there was a question for you about labor. In your presentation, you mentioned that they were supportive of the pilot, and Alex from EBHO is asking, how have folks been able to establish collaborative relationships with the building trades and others on projects that involve prefab or volunteer construction, expediting permitting? How have you forged those relationships?
Very carefully and strategically, I would say. For our pilot project, I think for those of you who have worked in San Francisco before, the labor relationships and just coalition building is a very important piece of the puzzle. My personal philosophy is that when we're trying to innovate something new, it's so important for us to lay the foundation for collaboration and maximizing on common ground. It's not about just jamming a new solution that is the most, 100% most efficient. Sometimes it's worth it to, wheel back on a little bit of the efficiency and even on the cost savings, if that means we can bring everybody along and give everybody a little bit of a win. So, quite frankly, with our on-site assembly system, there are probably engineering ways that we could have cut certain labor trades out. We decided not to do that because it's important for us to make sure that we are, through this exercise, allowing our government partners to feel like this is a competitive, viable option in the future, that they can continue to scale and not receive so much opposition that projects get stopped. And that is what we have seen in other solutions before with prefabrication. So that was definitely a calculated, conscientious effort. But we are also very adamant about, with our San Francisco project, from the very get-go, bringing on our union GC partner at Swinnerton, and because we know that they have a commitment towards, providing good labor jobs and partnering with the right subs. We carefully thought through that decision as well. In terms of the volunteer labor, by volunteer, it's basically we're offering donors who are maybe part of corporations and even community members who are, part of the stakeholder group, opportunities to do things that are outside of the scope of the GC contract, like painting or putting together furniture, cleaning the units. So we're not really taking labor jobs away. There's plenty of opportunities where there can be collaboration. The other really powerful thing that I feel like we have built is that we have actually helped Swinnerton to establish a relationship with the local apprenticeship program called Success Centers, and they're a fantastic program where they're trying to uplift, basically minority communities that are from low-income backgrounds and giving them hours under a very, well-established, great GC firm to get their hours in so that they can become part of the qualified skilled labor force. So, I think there's a lot of opportunities to find ways to expand, and support each other. And that's where we're focused on, is like finding those areas where we can agree and kind of amplifying that.
That's super, super helpful. Thank you, Sharon. Well, we're coming up on the hour, and I just wanted to close us out with sort of a summary of what I've heard in the discussion today. The first is, we are not proposing that interim supportive housing replace permanent housing. We need both in our system in order to respond to the homelessness crisis that we are addressing in the region. We also need prevention, which is the 3 parts of the Regional Impact Council's strategy to reduce unsheltered homelessness over the next 3 years. I think another takeaway is we have to grow the pie. We can no longer just rob Peter to pay Paul and then get Jerry back tomorrow to pay for some other. We actually need enough resources to put simultaneous investments in these solutions that work. I thought Joanne's point about how powerful it is that someone who is unhoused on the street has a 6% chance of being stably housed than once they're in interim supportive housing and able to transition into permanent housing much more efficiently and effectively. Those are the kinds of solutions that beg for interim housing solutions. And we think it's critically important that we support our jurisdictions on this call and others to really think strategically about how you don't have to rob your permanent housing budgets for interim solutions, but that we can do a collaborative strategy to bring all of the partners to the table to help us resource each of these interventions that are critically important. So thank you all so much for your attention today. Thank you to our panelists. We will continue these conversations. Edie has put in the chat. We'll share both the recording and the slide deck with you all. And as Ken said, look out for this toolkit that we're creating so that it can give you all some guidance about how to integrate interim supportive housing into your solution set. Thank you all so much. Have a good day.